Buenos dias. Sex is great. If you believe that, say it with me. Sex is great. And it's important that we begin at this place, because as we begin our conversation over the next couple of days about sexual abuse, about how it has been perverted in many ways, it's important to remember that sex is great. And that's basically where I want to begin this conversation, because the intimacy that I share with my wife is but a pale reflection of the oneness I will have with the Creator of the universe for all eternity. That is why sex is great. It's a preview of great things to come. Now, there was a time in church history when churches would be divided over issues like transubstantiation. Today, churches are divided over issues dealing with sexuality, whether it be women in ministry, whether it be homosexuality, whether it be premarital sex. This is what divides churches today. Therefore, this conversation is crucial. Sex is great. The Hebrew tradition seems to have grasped this. See, in the Talmud, it says that men are expected to satisfy the sexual needs of their wives. The Mishnah Torah tells us that within the bedchamber, the couple could participate in any form of sexual activity that is satisfying, and quote, whether it be natural or unnatural, unquote, whatever that means. Rabbi Moshe ben Nahum says that when a couple are engaged in sex, God is present at that moment. So much so that many of the rabbinical commentators refer to the bedchamber as the Holy of Holies, which you recall in Jewish tradition, that's the place where God is present in the temple. According to many of these rabbinical commentators, the best time to engage in sex is on the Sabbath. There is a holiness to sex. I mean, just read the Song of Songs in the Bible, where fruits and their juices become signifiers for the body parts and bodily fluids that they distill. The constant enjoyment in chapter 4, verse 16 of, quote, eating the choicest fruits, end quote, becomes a double entendre for enjoying sexual pleasure, specifically all pleasures. The garden, referred to in chapter 4, verses 12 through 15, that opens to her beloved to enter, is a euphemism for the woman's body. Her garden may be locked up, but his, quote, fountain can make her garden fertile as streams of living waters flow down. The beloved, which, by the way, we are told they're not married, in chapter 5, verse 1, comes into the garden and eats and drinks from it. It comes down to her garden to enjoy it in chapter 6, verse 2. In her garden are clusters of grapes, according to chapter 7, verse 12, triangular in shape, surrounded by foliage and gorged with juices. These lovers have participated in the spoon position as made clear in chapter 2, verse 6, and chapter 8, verse 3. Allow me to quote from God's holy word, where the woman, according to chapter 5, verses 4 through 5, states as follows: My beloved thrust his hand through the opening, and I trembled to the core of my being for him. Then I rose to open myself to my beloved. My hand dripped with mirth, pure mirth, off my fingers onto the handle of the bolt. Is it getting warm here? Try preaching that on Sunday. And yet somehow Christianity made a wrong turn early in its history. You see, Christianity developed a dichotomy between what is sacred, the spirit, and what is profane, the body. The Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 50 tells us, quote, "Flesh and blood is not able to inherit God's kingdom, nor does the corrupt inherit the incorruption." You see, Paul infused into his thinking a Neoplatonic body-spirit split, which has always been foreign to the Hebrew Bible. He also was influenced by Stoic philosophy that had a proclivity against the human body, to devalue the body. Yet, Christianity adopted these views and has given us a sexual ethics for the last 2,000 years that I suspect may be responsible for a lot of the abuses that are occurring within the church today. Amen. You see, sex for the early Christians was only for marriage, for the sole and only purpose of procreation. The only reason you got married was to have children. Clement of Alexander said, and I quote, "To indulge in intercourse without intending children is an outrage to nature." All the early church fathers, we never hear from the church mothers, all the early church fathers had a dim view of sexuality. Augustine tells us that there is no difference between having sex in marriage and having sex with a prostitute. And he should know. Marriage is only permissible for procreation. That means within a marriage, to have sex during the woman's menstrual cycle or after menopause is unnatural and cannot occur because it's a violation of our holiness before God. All sex, all forms of sexual acts that do not specifically lead to procreation is unnatural. Hence, all sex, anal sex, the use of contraceptions, homosexuality, masturbation, all of these acts become unnatural, unholy, and a violation of God's holy word. Now, here's what I mean by having this form of sexual ethics can lead to abuse. Many of these church fathers would write that it is better to rape a young girl than to engage in masturbation because at least raping a girl was natural. When we have a problematic foundation, we should not therefore be surprised that we come up with a sexual ethic that is damaging, specifically to the most vulnerable among us. So sex had to be avoided, even within marriage. Jerome, who translated the Bible for us, says, and I quote, "Either we pray always and are virgins, or we cease to pray that we may fulfill the claim of marriage." In Jerome's mind, even within marriage, to engage in sexual activity prevented you from praying to Almighty God. Pope Gregory the Great is writing a thesis on Saint Benedict. Benedict, you will recall, was the one that began the monastery in the desert. And in his essay, he says a very interesting little passage which fascinated me. He talks about St. Benedict one day walking through the desert, and Satan appears to him in the form of a little bird. And at that moment, he remembers the vision of a young woman of his youth. And he is full with lust. And he is so full with lust that at that moment, he is about to quit his career. Not much of a career, but he was about to quit living in the desert and return to civilization, because the passions of the flesh were just too much for him. And at that moment, he notices some cacti on the floor. Cacti is the plural of cactus, right? Okay. So notice some cacti on the floor. So he takes off all his clothes, and he plunges himself upon the cacti and begins to roll around in it until he has thorns in his body, he's bleeding, and his lust somehow dissipates. Now, I don't know about you, but that sounds more like S&M to me. It is better to torture the body than to remember the visions of our youth. It is important, therefore. No, it is crucial that we get sexual ethics right. Say it again. Sex is great. Amen. You see, it's important because the type of relationship I have in my bedchamber reflects the type of social structures I create within the overall society. Ladies, excuse me for a second. I need to talk to the hermanos in the room. Men, if our relationship with our wife is paternalistic, more than likely our political and social views towards the other will probably be paternalistic as well. If our relationship in the bedchamber is one of domination and domestication, there's a good chance that when we treat people of color within our culture and our society, it will be one of domination and domestication also. See, I strongly believe that we can begin to talk about effectively eradicating the lingering racism and classism within our society when we begin to deal with the sexism within our marriages. I believe that they are connected. We cannot separate them. If we're used to having abusive relationships within our own family, why should we be surprised that they manifest themselves within our social structures? So for that reason, it's important that we get sexual ethics right. It's important that we understand the connection between these things. Now, I'm a Bible-thumping, Spirit-filled, born-again Southern Baptist minister who just loves the Bible. I mean, it's an important book in my life. And yet, if I'm going to be faithful to the biblical text, I have to realize that there's some things in there that are a little problematic. I have to respect it enough to be intellectually faithful in struggling like Jacob with the text, demanding the blessing, and knowing that if I do see the face of God, I'll probably limp away. And that's okay. And the problematic part I want to talk a little bit about today deals with how women are understood within the pages of the Bible. Clement of Alexander said, quote, "Every woman should be filled with shame by the thought that she is a woman." You see, the problem that I'm having with how women are portrayed in the biblical text is not that they're second-class citizens. They should be so lucky. Is that they're property. They're not even citizens. It's that they are property. I mean, look at the 10th commandment. What is it? Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's what? Wife, ox, donkey, house. You see, the wife, like an ox, donkey, or house, is another possession of the man. It doesn't say thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's spouse. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's possessions, which includes the woman, or I'm sorry, the women. You see, for those who are biblical scholars, I'm not one, but they tell me that when the Bible talks about prostitution, adultery, and incest, these all appear under the category of property law. That is where they are located. Because to take another man's woman is not an act of infidelity, it's an act of trespassing. I am trespassing on someone else's property. Hence, adultery only applied to women. Thou shalt not commit adultery. It didn't apply to men. Only if the man was married and had relationships with a woman who was married, then both were to be stoned. But adultery didn't apply to men. I mean, remember in John 10, was it 8? No, it's 10. When they catch a woman in the very act of adultery and they bring her to Jesus? Now, if they caught her in the very act, where's the guy? I mean, shouldn't there be two people there? But you see, he wasn't committing adultery, even though he probably was married. She was, because she's the woman. So adultery only applied to women. If I was to rape a virgin, according to Exodus 22, verse 15 and 16, I was responsible to pay her father for his loss of property. See, I had no responsibility towards the young girl I raped. My responsibility was to her father, who lost the value of his property when I trespassed upon it. In fact, after the marriage, Deuteronomy 22, verse 13 to 21, after the marriage, the father had to prove that his daughter was indeed a virgin. Hence the tradition of hanging the sheets, marriage sheets, on the outside of the house to prove that, yes, she was a virgin. And of course, you always kept a chicken around just in case, she wasn't, but that's another story. So, Moses tells us in Deuteronomy 21, verses 10 through 14, that when you invade another country, and if you find some young Chiquita that catches your eye, take her as your sex slave. Sex slave, Moses tells us, is permissible. One of my favorite, of course, is Lot. You all know the story. Men came knocking on the door and said, you have strangers among you. Send them out so that we may know them. And of course, you know that to know, it's not that they passed out business cards. It was, an euphemism for having sexual relations with. So send them out so that we may know them. And of course, we preach on this. It is against homosexuality and all this stuff. But we ignore what the text is actually saying. Because the next verse, Lot comes out and says, please do no harm to these men who have taken shelter under the shadow of my roof. But wait, I got 2 virgin daughters. Do with them whatever you want. You see, women as property were always available as ransom for men. The value of the strangers in Lot's house was worth more than 2 virgin daughters. Women as property was a way by which I can conquer my enemy. Remember when Absalom, 2 Samuel chapter 15 and 16, when Absalom, the son of King David, rebelled against his father, and he enters into Jerusalem with his army and David escapes, what's the first thing that Absalom does? He sets up a tent on top of the palace and he rapes all of King David's harem. Why does he do this? It has nothing to do with sex. It has to do with him taking physical possession of the property of his father, thus proving to all of Jerusalem that he is now in his father's place. So when Reuben, one of the 12 sons of Israel, climbs onto the bed of his father's concubine, it has nothing to do with sex. It has to do with taking his father's possessions to prove that he is now the man. He's now the leader. He's now usurped the power of the patriarch. And of course, women as possession could lead to very dangerous understandings of God. Now again, I love the Bible. But I tell you, Ezekiel 23 sends shivers up my spine. This is where Israel is being portrayed as a woman who is unfaithful to God. And how does God treat this unfaithful woman? After accusing her of whoring, he sets her up to be gang raped by all the other nations, finally thrusting a spear through her to put her out of her misery. This is my loving God. So we have to begin to realize that however we define sexual ethics, we need to move around ideas like, well, I believe in the biblical marriage. Because quite frankly, the biblical marriage means that a man could have as many wives as he could afford. Deuteronomy tells me I could have a harem, I just can't have 2 sisters in it. Couldn't get my wife to agree on that one. The last thing I want is a biblical marriage where I could have sex slaves, occasional prostitutes, harems, where I can dispose of my property to benefit other men. That's not what I want. If anything, it's somewhat unchristian. So how do we develop a biblical ethics that is still rooted within the biblical tradition of a loving God and of love without getting trapped in a legalism that only fosters sexual abuse? The problem that we sometimes have, one last thing before I move on. I've been obviously quoting the Hebrew Bible, but the New Testament also has some problematic verses as well. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 14 through 15 tells me that it was not Adam who was led astray, but the woman who was led astray and fell into sin. Nevertheless, she will be saved by childbearing. I don't know if you ever really thought about that particular verse for a second. I always thought that women were saved by grace, not works, lest anyone should boast. I always thought that salvation was a free gift. Why is Paul linking salvation to childbearing? And more problematic, what if you can't have children? You're not saved? What if you don't want to have children? You're not saved? Paul is obviously pulling from this tradition in where the woman's role is basically to have children, period, to procreate. A tradition the church will be wise to move away from. So, how have we approached sexual ethics? Over the last 2,000 years, very poorly, I think. See, for conservatives, sex is a dangerous but controllable through rules and regulations. So for conservatives, the issue is thou shalt not, and in the list of sexual activities one should not engage in, many times rooted in this tradition that sees the purpose of sex as having children. Now for liberals, sex is something that has been privatized. It's whatever two consenting adults engage in, that's between them, and we have no... And that may sound good, but what we sometimes forget is that what occurs in the privacy has communal ramifications. And I pointed out earlier, if that privacy is somewhat abusive, it does affect our community. There was nothing private. Everything is interactive. Therefore, allow me to propose, if I may, what I call a liberationist approach to sexual ethics. If you don't know by now, I am a liberationist. Surprise. What that means is that I listen and base my theological reflection on the voices of the disenfranchised. In other words, any sexual ethics that we can begin to construct must be rooted in the testimonies and the voices of those who have been abused by our present social structures. Any sexual ethics can never come from those who benefit from how society is structured. It must come from the marginalized, from the dispossessed, from the disenfranchised, because they have what W.E.B. Du Bois calls that double consciousness, to know the world of the oppressor as well as the world of the oppressed. Doesn't mean they're right, doesn't mean they're holier, it just means they have a better grasp of reality because they know the official views, but they also know the views from the underside of history. So any sexual ethics that we begin to develop must be rooted in the testimonios, in the testimonies of those who are the abused within this subject. Any sexual ethics we develop must pay close attention to power relationships. We must understand what we say is ethical. Who does it benefit? And usually and historically, whatever we claim to be ethical seem to always benefit those who are in power. So somehow we need to be very cognizant of the power relationships that exist in any ethics we develop. And finally, a liberationist ethical approach to this is rooted in John 10:10. For I have come to give life and give life abundantly. How do I read the Bible? We all enter the Bible through a particular verse. You know, if we enter the Bible through a patriarchal, homophobic viewpoint, then we begin to read verses that justify our views. I choose to enter the Bible through John 10:10. I have come to give life and life abundantly. Therefore, when I read a passage of Scripture that does not provide life, nor does it provide it abundantly, either I got it wrong or I ignore it. Now, it's a Baptist speaking here. Now, Jesus did the same thing. Remember, Jesus said, you heard it say, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. He's quoting the Bible. But I say unto you, ignore that. That's wrong. I say to you, if someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the left one as well. See, Jesus taught me that when I read the Bible, if it does not bring abundant life to the very least of these, then I need to somehow realize that I am interpreting this wrong and I need to move on. Hence, I don't spend much time in the book of Joshua, genocide a whole people. I have problems with that. So, this liberationist ethics moves away from rules and regulations and commandments because it realizes that human life is fluid and messy and contradictory, and therefore, how do we do ethics in the messiness of life? Where those who are oppressed are well aware that sometimes there are no right choices. Sometimes the choice is between bad and worse. And how do we find biblical guidance to wrestle with those choices, knowing, like Jacob, we may limp away? Now, I base this type of sexual ethics on what I call a familial sexual ethics. And in a shameless act of self-promotion, I'm taking this from a book I published a few years ago called A Lily Among the Thorns, A New Christian Sexual Ethics. And here's why I go into this in greater detail. But for now, let me at least touch upon this a little bit. This familial ethics is really based on my own culture. I come from a culture of familia. And the familia is the family. And you get stuck with the family you have, but somehow you work together for the good of the family. And that becomes very important to us. It's very, within Eurocentric culture, there is this individualism, this salient individualism that exists. Within my culture, it's la familia that exists. I'm part of a whole. I'm not an individual, but I have a responsibility and am connected to my familia. So I try to build a sexual ethics on this idea of familia, and I translate to English to familial, which means there's a mutual commitment in any sexual ethics. And it's a sexual ethics that's not ruled by covenant. We like to talk about we have a covenant relationship. I move away from covenant because for me, covenant is a business transaction that is necessary after the fall. I want to get back to before the fall, where there was this familia between Adam and Eve. I want to understand what this type of relationship was like. Hence, I don't like covenant language for this when talking about relationships. It's not like I'll give you 14 cows and 3, I can't say pigs because they're Jewish, but 14 cows, 3 sheep for your wife. That's a covenant. That's a negotiation. I want to talk about this mutual relationship. And whatever this relationship is like, it's a mutual giving where we put the needs of the other before ourselves in order to dismantle patriarchy. Now, to put the needs of the other, now this is tricky, and we have to be very careful, because unfortunately women have always been told to put the needs of the husband before herself. This has become part of our Christian tradition, and where the woman obliterates her own self. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about how we develop a mutual relationship in where my thinking is always what is best for my wife, and her thinking is what is best for my husband. And together, we're constantly trying to build up the family by putting all the family members first. That makes sense. I don't want to go to that one-sided of she thinks that, but I don't have to. Because that's dangerous. There needs to be this mutual giving. It is, when I was in seminary, I remember my theology professor would always begin by having somebody, cry out their favorite Bible book verse. This is seminarians, everybody's holy, so they all cry out John 3:16 or something like that. I cried out Genesis 2:25. So people began looking in their Bibles, and it says basically, and the man and the woman were naked and felt no shame. That is still my favorite Bible verse. Because what it means is that I could stand before my wife totally naked with some 50 years of gravity, a little bit too much good Cuban cooking, and yet feel no shame. I mean, when I was 20, no problem. But now it's a little, I wear a shirt when I go to the beach. But you see, I could stand before my wife not just physically naked, emotionally naked, psychologically naked, totally vulnerable, and she could do likewise, and we feel no shame. See, that's the ideal, I think, that Genesis 2:25 gets at, that they both were naked and felt no shame. That, for me, becomes this familia, this familial way of doing sexual ethics based on that radical vulnerability. And of course, that vulnerability could lead to intoxication. The Song of Songs, chapter 5, verse 1 says, "Let us be drunk with love." I like that. Good Southern Baptists have no idea what it means to be drunk. But I'm told that to be drunk is to lose control of oneself and someone else. To be totally safe and vulnerable, that two people can lose control in each other. Whatever our sexual ethics is, it needs to be based on that drunkenness. And also, whatever this sexual ethics looks like, I think it should be based on the model of the Trinity. I know that sounds weird, but bear with me. When we think of the Trinity, what do we think of? Well, this God the Father, the Son, and then trailing in third place, the Holy Ghost. We add onto the Trinity this hierarchy, which goes totally against what the whole idea of the Trinity is. You see, the Trinity is supposed to be this place, this enigma where there is no hierarchy, where God, Son, and Spirit are co-equal, where there is no power relationship, where they share everything. They share in knowledge and in power. And when I say Spirit, I want to be clear that what I'm saying here is from the Hebrew word which is feminine, and the Greek word, which is also feminine. This is also, I think, part of the feminine part of the Trinity. So when I say that I want my relationship to be based on the model of the Trinity, that means that the Trinity is not an enigma that I'm trying to figure out as a good theologian, but rather it becomes a model of a hierarchical free relationship which is a communal in all forms of sharing. So whatever this sexual ethics is going to look like, I want to use that as one of my models. Right. In the book I mentioned, I introduced a term which I call ortho-eros. Ortho means correct, as in orthodoxy, correct doctrine. Eros means the erotic sexual. It's an attempt to try to understand what is a correct erotic sexual ethics, because after all, sex is great. I look at 1 Corinthians 10, verses 23 to 24, which says, quote, "Nothing to me is forbidden, but not all things do good. All things to me are lawful, but not all things build up. Let no one seek their own advantage, but each that of the other." Rather than beginning our sexual ethics by saying what is unlawful and what we shouldn't do, which is the way we have traditionally done sexual ethics, I like to begin by saying everything's open to me, but not everything is good. Some things causes harm. And if I mess up, as we all will in trying to do sexual ethics, the good news is that there is forgiveness and redemption, even when we get it wrong. And in the messiness of life, we will. So I begin not with rules, but this realization that what I need to look at in sexual ethics is not what I cannot do, but what causes harm and how I should not do no harm. That's a double negative. How I should do no harm. That's better. Which means that any sexual activity I engage in has to be consensual. Consensual in the means that it has to be equal partners. Not only equal partners in their relationship to each other, equal partners in power. Remember I talked about power earlier. Equal partners in power. For me, as a professor, to have sex with one of my students is harmful because I do not have equal power with my student. I am in a position of authority. I'm in a position of giving out grades. I could flunk her like that. So therefore, to do no harm means I cannot engage in any sexual act in where I have a power over someone else. Rather it be a student, as a minister, rather it be a member of my congregation, as an adult, rather it be a child, as someone who is competent, rather it be someone who has a mental challenge. Whatever creates an imbalance of power prevents me from entering a sexual relationship with that person because it will do them harm. Even when they themselves believe that it's okay. As a Latino, I know how my mind has been colonized for so long that sometimes I think that the abuses I receive is fine. And therefore, as the one with power, I have a responsibility to do no harm even when the other thinks it's okay. Whatever this ortho eros would look like, it is a sexuality of faithfulness. That is, if I truly want to be vulnerable with my significant other, and they vulnerable with me, to begin to include others in my personal sexual life would damage that mutual openness and that vulnerability. And I can't go there. Number one, it's not worth it. Because it is that mutuality, that vulnerability, and that faithfulness that allows me to stand here today and say, sex is great. Because without that, sex is okay, but it's not great if there is not that becoming one flesh in the same way that I will become one with God. And of course, this author eros would argue that sexuality needs to be mutually pleasing. I must trust in my partner not to hurt me or deny me pleasure. In the same way, I cannot hurt or deny pleasure to my sexual partner. And sexual pleasure is defined however we too choose to define it. So, the relationship between the sheets becomes the basis for justice within our community. If that relationship is hierarchical or abusive, we should not be surprised that how we treat our spouse in the bedchambers becomes a reflection of how we treat the disenfranchised within our community and our culture. Let me end by saying once again, in case you forgot, and if you forget everything I say, I want you to remember this. Sex is great. Thank you.